Hey everybody. This is definitely not coming exactly a week after the last one was uploaded. Summer hit us hard. Of my four kids, three of them have had birthdays within 10 days of each other. And between the fourth and some travel up to the Ute to see family, it has been crazy. And I had this done before we went to Michigan, but I didn't have enough internet to upload it while we were there. And since I got back, it has been nonstop. So I'm finally getting to the point of just making the quick recording and uploading it and calling it good. But this week, we are going to jump into the book of Ruth and study the character of Ruth. It's a super easy read. It's short. It's only 4 chapters. It's one of only 2 books in the Bible named after a woman. And Ruth is the only book of the Bible named after somebody who is not Hebrew. Ruth was not an Israelite. And so her story, super great. There's been lots of books and movies written about it. I always loved the story of Ruth because my parents named my sister Ruth. So there's always a lot of fascination with that as a kid. But true to form, I feel like this happens pretty much all the time. Reading it again always brings a fresh round of observations or insights or something that just speaks to your heart. And so it's definitely worth doing, even if it's someone you feel really familiar with. And we hit Ruth at a kind of like transitional, like kind of rocky time in the nation of Israel. So they have left Egypt where they were slaves. They took the promised land. They got rid of most of the tribes they were supposed to get rid of from other enemy nations. And everyone's kind of like set up shop and like trying to kind of live and work off the land and things like that. At this point in time, Israel still doesn't have a king, but Moses and Joshua have long been dead. And so the system they have in place is with judges, and judges are kind of like vague in how they happen. It's kind of like a prophet in that usually there's somebody that God has spoken directly to and brings the word of the Lord to the nation as a whole. And that judge wouldn't have been like a judge in a courtroom like now, but a judge would have been kind of like someone who would settle disputes and then be like, this is what God says you should do, kind of a thing. So Ruth is sandwiched between Judges and Samuel is the one who anoints and brings about the first kings of Israel. So she's this little tiny character in this little point in history where like they're trying to figure out how to rule themselves as a nation. Judges, the book right before Ruth, ends with saying, hold on here so I can actually get it right. It says, in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as they saw fit, which makes chaos. Living as everyone sees fit is never a great way to have anything, a household, much less an entire nation, be run. And so we meet Ruth a little bit after the story starts. The story really starts at this point in history with a couple from Bethlehem. Their names are Naomi and Elimelech, and they are basically farmers. And they are Ephrathites, which would be from the tribe of Ephraim. They were half tribes of Joseph, like coat of many colors. Joseph, he had 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and they each had their own tribe. Instead of a tribe of Joseph, he got blessed with a double portion. His sons each were considered a half tribe. And so they are directly related to Joseph from long ago. They're living in Bethlehem. And besides everybody doing as they see in their own eyes, doing what they think is right, besides all that going on, a famine hits the land. And so Elimelech decides to move his family to Moab, which is a country that's like a border country. So think like Canada or Mexico. If you live in the north, it's not a big deal to go up to Canada for the day and come back down. If you live in the south, real far south, like Texas, it's not a huge deal to go to Mexico because it's just right there. You can move, live there for a short time, and come back. So Elimelech takes Naomi, and they had 2 young sons at the time, Mahlon and Chilion, and they moved to Moab. We don't like get an exact time frame. We know that they're in Moab for 10 years, roughly. Elimelech would have arranged for his sons to be married, because typically fathers handled that. It wasn't something the kids could just go out and do. So it says that they both took Moabite brides, Mahlon and Chilion did, but Elimelech died. So the whole reason they're there is because Elimelech thought this was the best move for their family, and he arranges wives for his sons, and he dies. So this is already like a not great situation made worse by the head of the house and like their leader, their patriarch, dying. So Malin and Chilion married Moabite women named Ruth and Orpah. And it says not a ton, but it basically says that like they were married. We don't know for how long. We can assume it was not a super long time because neither Ruth or Orpah had children. And in that day and age, that would have been a really rare thing. Or they had been married. Maybe they got married like the first couple of years they were there and had been married for a number of years, but neither of them had children, in which case they would have both been barren, which would have also been like a mark of shame or like a place of great lack in their lives. So not only do they not have their father, their wives are both childless. And then Malin and Chilion both die. And so Naomi is left in a foreign country without her husband or her sons, which would have been like her support, her protection, her provision. There's nothing for her to stay in Moab. She has no relatives. No one will take care of a random widow. And there's not like a lot of job opportunities for unmarried, unprotected women. It's a pretty dangerous time to be a woman who's alone. And so she calls in Ruth and Orpah to her and she says, listen, I love you both like daughters, but there's no chance, even if I got married tonight and got pregnant tonight, like you'll be too old to marry. Like there's no chance of me having more sons for you to marry. So even though it'd be tradition for you to come with me, you really should go back. You'll have a way better chance. You can get married to men here of your own culture in your own country. You should go back to your families. And at first the girls are like, no, we're going to stay with you. And she's like, listen, I can't take you as non-Jews back. You will not be received well. You will be considered an outsider. You will be scorned. You won't be allowed to worship with us. You won't be allowed to eat with us. Like it's not good. You will be an outsider and an outcast. You'll be widowed. There's going to be no way for you to make a living. Like you need to go back to your own parents and your own families, and hopefully life will treat you better. And so Orpah does go back to her family, but Ruth makes this beautiful statement. And in one of the studies I was reading, they call this her conversion point. So as women brought into a Jewish household, they would have been taught about Yahweh, the one true God, and they would have learned some of the Hebrew laws around like eating and washing, their traditions. They would have heard stories about God. And that doesn't necessarily mean they became practicing Jews, but they would have been incredibly familiar with it. So in this statement by Ruth, we come to understand the depth of the faith that Naomi and Elimelech must have instilled in their household, because she literally like takes everything, all the warnings Naomi just gave her, and just tosses them out the door. And she says, this is verse 16 of chapter 1. Urge me not to leave you or to turn back from following you. For where you go, I'll go. And where you live, I will live. And your people will be my people. And your God will be my God. And where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. Nothing but, and she's like, let the Lord do anything to me, but nothing but death is going to separate us. So you see like big love for Naomi in that. But also like the transformation that must have gone in her own heart in encountering this God who was so different than the gods the Moabites would have had. The Moabites' main god would have been similar to like Baal we learned about with Elisha and Elijah. So there's a lot of child sacrifice. It's very brutal. Yahweh would have been very opposite of any of the Moabite gods, and their families as a result, Naomi and Elimelech's family, would have lived vastly different lives than Ruth would have experienced growing up. So Ruth makes this beautiful declaration, like, no, regardless, I'm going, like, I love you and I'll die with you. And your God is my God. Like, there's nothing for me to go back to, essentially. So they pack up and they make the trip back to Bethlehem. It would have been likely on foot. And as they're returning back, and they start to enter Bethlehem, and there are people at the well, as there always are. And they recognize Naomi and they're like, she's back. And they go to greet her, and Naomi's like, don't call me Naomi anymore, because Naomi means pleasant. She said, called me Mara, because it means bitter, because God had dealt bitterly with her, and she left rich and she came back poor, basically. So she's saying, like, she left with a husband and sons, and she's returning with nothing. And so everyone's like, that's not great. And they get back to their family home where Naomi and Elimelech would have raised their sons. And, you'd be starting with an abandoned house with no money and no men to help you with anything. And so it says that it's the time of the barley harvest. And it was tradition, like Jewish law, this was built into their harvest rules, but it was common in other countries too. So Ruth is familiar with this suggestion she brings for Naomi. She says, listen, it's harvest time. Let me go out to the fields and glean. And what gleaning was that as a group of men went through and harvested a field, widows, orphans, poor people were allowed to go to follow behind them and pick up stuff that they didn't collect and take that to eat or to sell. And so in Jewish law, men were required to leave every so many handfuls. You were supposed to leave a handful down for the gleaners. So, and they were not allowed to be like, you couldn't yell at them or drive them off. Like it was expected. This was like kind of a tithe of your crops. And so Ruth goes out to the field to glean, and Naomi's like, well, we do have to eat. And so she heads out, and it's a pretty desperate situation. They would have had very little resources. Likely they traveled from Moab to Bethlehem on foot, would have taken several days, and they come back to an empty, abandoned house. So she pretty much has to go do something to obtain food. She starts going out to glean, and she happens to stop and glean in a field belonging to a cousin of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And Boaz comes to the field to check how his harvesters are doing, and he notices Ruth. And I don't know, her skin color would have been different, but her dress as a Moabite would be slightly different than a Hebrew. So somehow he recognizes that she is not Hebrew and she's not local. But also Bethlehem is always in the Bible called a little town. So I pretend like this is Newark. This is somewhere really little where everybody kind of knows everybody, or at least they know who they are. So he sees her and she's working super hard. And so he asks his foreman, like, what's up with her? And he's like, she's a super hard worker. She almost never takes breaks. Like she's doing everything she can to take care of Naomi, and Boaz is super impressed by this. So he calls her over, and he tells her, make sure you stay in my fields. I will make sure my servants protect and make sure that you're not mistreated by anyone. And he had some, it says maid servants. So women were also working in the field. He's like, work with them so the men don't harm you, and stay here for the whole harvest. Just follow them as they go field to field. And so she's like thankful. And then he goes on and he blesses her, and he says, the Lord recompense you for what you've done, and a full reward will be given to you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. That's in chapter 2, verse 12. And from there, after he blesses her, which would be well above and beyond what would be expected, he tells her to come and have lunch with his workers, and he charges his workers to be nice, basically. So Ruth comes home to Naomi, and Naomi is shocked by how much she brings back. And she's like elated when Ruth tells her about Boaz. And so Naomi goes on to explain that he's a near relative who has the right to redeem, which brings us to this really cool concept in Hebrew law and culture. And that is the role of the kinsman redeemer. So again, this is in Mosaic law. This is something God set up when the children of Israel were leaving Egypt and wandering around in the desert forever, and God gave them a whole bunch of laws. And in that was the role of the redeemer. So what it was that since this is a culture and a time in history where a woman without a husband or a woman without sons has basically no legal rights or standings, she's destitute, and she is definitely at risk to be abused and taken advantage of and hurt, and they're like, life's not great for her, and it probably won't ever get great for her without a man. And so the provision that is made for the kinsman redeemer is that a close male relative, and it would have to be from her husband's, even if he died, her dead husband's father's side. So somebody who would have that same last name, like that same family line. It could be a brother or a cousin, but over time, scholars, not just random people who study these things, think that it probably extended beyond just being like immediate family to a little bit wider circle, because it just often needed to be. And so Boaz probably was some kind of cousin. But the cousin could, for a very low price, buy the land that would have been left by the widow's husband. And he could work it, he could sell and have profit from it. But ultimately, his job was to marry the widow and have a child with her, a son. And that son would not have his last name, but would have the dead husband's last name. And that son would inherit all the land that he bought. So he got it for super cheap, basically, to work until the child was old enough to take it over and have it as his inheritance. But it was a way to preserve their family line and to make sure that widows were taken care of in a way where they couldn't be abused, couldn't be taken advantage of, and like it would be secure. Because obviously if they have a son, then they'd also have care in their older age, or even if this husband passed away. So the whole point was to protect and to preserve both the family line, the inheritance, and the woman who was left in a vulnerable position. So that's a kinsman redeemer. And Boaz is said that he is a relative who is able to redeem. So he's relatively close in some capacity. Ruth is like, this is cool, but that's like, she doesn't go beyond that, but it's just like, we found someone who's generous and going to take care of us. He's a relative, and this is a place where we can continue to glean and be safe and have a means of living and eating every day. And so here we go. So it says that Ruth continued to work all throughout the harvest. And as harvest was drawing towards the end, they did something called thresh. And they would basically like thresh, separate the wheat from the chaff, and like be able to then have that like finished product ready to use or sell, however they decided to do it. But the threshing part of harvest was only done by men. So this isn't a part that Ruth was a part of. But as she came home at the end of harvest, Naomi's like, listen, it's time to take action. You need to stop dressing like a widow. And we're going to put you in some clean clothes and give you a good bath. And then I want you to go down to the threshing floor. And you're going to watch for Boaz. Don't let anyone see you. You're going to watch for Boaz. And after they're done working and they eat and drink and everyone's kind of like relaxed for the night, watch where he lays down. And I want you to go over to where he is and lay down by his feet and use the edge of his cloak and cover yourself with it. And then when he wakes up, tell him that you'd like him to claim the role as kinsman redeemer. So to us now, this sounds super bizarre, but symbolically, at that point in time, if a man were to cover a woman with a cloak, that meant he was going to take care of her. And so basically it was a way to approach him where kind of sneaky, but sneaky in a way that wouldn't cause Boaz shame. So by right, if he said no to Ruth asking him to step in and be their redeemer, she could call him out in front of the whole village and all the elders, and he could be shamed, basically. And so by going in at night and being a little bit covert about it, it's kind of giving Boaz a backdoor to say no. And so Ruth is like the bravest person ever, because I don't know if I'd be able to do that, but she goes ahead. She takes off her mourning clothes and she takes a bath and puts on clothes that would basically be like what any woman would wear, but that would also mean she was available or willing to be joined with another person again. So she sneaks up, does all the things Naomi says, and Boaz wakes up as Ruth is there by his feet, and he's shocked. And so another commentary point that I read said that likely Boaz was not a young man. In all his interactions with Ruth, he calls her my daughter. And if he was a cousin to Elimelech, he probably was closer to Naomi's age than Ruth. And so he's definitely not like this, like a lot of the books, or if you've ever seen a movie of it, like they make him look really young and it's like very romantic. And like this wasn't so much like that. But his response when she lays out what she's asking, he responds incredibly honorable, and he talks about her character. So this isn't like, oh, pretty lady at my feet, I'm going to take advantage of you and here we go. No, he says, all the people in the city know you are a woman of strength and worth, bravery and capability. And he told her to stay until morning, so nothing would happen if she went home in the dark alone. But that she should leave before everyone else woke up, so nobody would speak badly of her, like a woman shouldn't be on the threshing floor kind of a thing. And he said that he would gladly take the role as their kinsman redeemer, but there's somebody who was a closer relative, and he would go and talk about it in the morning. And so Ruth stays with him, and as daylight starts to break, he sends her back to Naomi, but he first gives her like this giant portion of grain to take back, kind of as a bride price, and kind of also honoring just what she's asked of him. So she heads back to Naomi, and Naomi at this point starts to get kind of funny because she's like, he'll get things settled. Don't before the day's done, basically. Like, mark my words. Like, think of like an old know-it-all lady who's like, oh, I know what's going to happen here. And so she's like, we'll know by the end of tonight, and you're going to be married. And it's like, okay. So Boaz goes out, true to what Naomi said, bright and early. He goes to the gates where the elders would have met, and he calls, there has to be a witness of like 10 men or something. So he calls like the 10 leaders of their town, and he has them all sit down, and he says, I need to make a business transaction. I need you guys to witness this. And he also goes and he gets this other relative who would be before him in the line of succession as the kinsman redeemer. So he's like, hey, relative, Naomi's back in town, and do you want the redeemer's right to buy the field and his property and keep it in the family? And the relative's like, absolutely. And Boaz is like, okay, great. Then you'll also be really happy to marry the Moabite widow, Ruth, so she can have a son and we can redeem Elimelech's property through the law. And the other relative is like, ooh, my wife will not go with that. I will not take that risk. You can do it. And so Boaz is like, awesome. So he's like talking to the 10 elders, like, all right, you guys all heard him. Give me your sandal, which somehow was a sign of making a deal. So he takes his other relative's sandal and he marches down and marries Ruth. And the deal is set. So Boaz marries Ruth, and even though she was for some time married to Mahlon without a child, it says that the Lord blessed Ruth and Boaz, and she pretty quickly after getting married conceived, and a son was born. And he's legally recognized not just as the grandchild, he's kind of seen as Naomi's son, like in place. It says that Naomi had him on her knees, which would have been a symbol like after being born, to place a baby on another woman's knees meant like she was the one who was like over that child. And so Naomi is redeemed, Ruth is redeemed, their family line is saved and redeemed. And the women of the village like go on this little statement about Ruth, and they give her the highest praise. So in their culture, Moab was like the worst, and people from Moab were the worst. And they take this Moabite widow who's now been redeemed by this relative, and she has worked super hard and really proven her love for Naomi. She has proven her faithfulness to the family she married into. And now she's had this child, and she's in essence letting it be Naomi's heir. And so they call her better than 7 sons. So it speaks really highly of Ruth's character on a whole, that the community, it's not just Naomi being thankful to God for redeeming their family line, but the whole community can just recognize the incredible sacrifice and value of Ruth and her obedience and in what like her actions were for Naomi and for their family. They named the little boy Obed, and he is the father of Jesse, who was the father of King David. So it was like this really close, cool connection to King David, who many generations later is also in the family line that Jesus is born into. And so this outsider, this woman from a nation that is looked down on and scorned, who is a widow, who would be even more scorned, is obedient in following her Hebrew mother-in-law, in working hard, in taking the action she could to help take care of their tiny little family, and then is further obedient in walking through the right of the kinsman redeemer. Boaz is faithful, even in what strangeness that would have presented, to do his job as the redeemer. And God massively blesses them. They are literally in line of the family that brings about Jesus. And so you have redemption on many, many levels. Remember, I said before the book of Ruth, we have the book of Judges, and it talks about how there's no king and there's chaos, and it's just like not great. And we see Naomi, and she is in chaos. Life has not been kind to her, and everything's up in the air. And Ruth is not even of that Hebrew culture to feel allegiance or a reason to go back into a place where she'd be treated badly, but she does, because she has seen the faithfulness and the reality of Yahweh God. And she has basically like fallen in love with her mother-in-law and the way they do life. And so she goes, and God works beautiful redemption through that too. And so another cool note that I found was that in 4 chapters, the word redeemer is used 23 times, or redeem. And the entire book centers around the redemption that God brings, yes, in their immediate lives, but in the whole scope of the entire Bible, or even the entire world, if you want to be like super pulled back, is the redemption and the plan to bring Jesus out of places of chaos, out of abandonment, out of maybe seasons of famine, out of brokenness, out of lawlessness, out of places where there's no rule and no headship. We see God's faithfulness to individuals who will stand and continue to do the right thing, whether that's the right thing in the character of Ruth, whether that's the right thing in the character of Naomi, and being like, listen, we're already in a bad spot, but I'm going to go back home because that's go back to my roots, go back to support, even though there's nothing here to keep me and there's not a lot waiting for me back home, I'm going to return. Or if it's the person of Boaz, who taking a Moabite wife would have been really looked down on once you're back in Israel, and he didn't let that stop. He saw the character of Ruth, and he like followed through and did his job of redemption. As a whole, that in and of itself is inspiring to think about, for sure. As I was talking a little bit with my sister Ruth while I was up in Michigan this past week, she was sharing, she and her husband, who is a pastor, are in the middle of moving to a new call. And there has been so much upheaval. And this was one that her husband felt really called to do. And Ruth was like, it's not the one she would have chosen. And she was saying, just like in looking back over all their wrestling and sorting out, like, do we go? Do we stay? God first challenged her that she could be Leah, who was Jacob's wife. And when it was time to go to the land God called them to, she was like, oh, sure, I'll go. But she like hid the household gods. Like she said one thing and did complete opposite things. Or she could be Sarah, who was Abraham's wife, who supported her husband, but often like almost to his own detriment. Like she'd cover and be like, oh yeah, we're not married, I'm his sister. That's not true. And it caused a lot of problems. So you have a woman who's like says one thing and does another, a woman who supports, but like almost covers for wrongdoing, covers for cowardice, covers for not speaking the truth. Or she, my sister, could be like Ruth, who wasn't apathetic, wasn't gonna like be wishy-washy, but would go ahead and look at the land and see, well, I can't do a lot, but I can go in and I can glean with these harvesters. I can take these hard steps that don't make a lot of sense right now, because I know God's call is faithful, and I know what he is pulling us towards is going, like there's always redemption. There's always fruit in where God calls us. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's the kind of fruit we would want to see or hope to see necessarily, but it's very real. And just as faithfully as we can look at Boaz's role as a redeemer, Jesus's role to redeem is that much greater, that much more amplified in our lives. And so that was something, like, as I just sat and meditated on her position, was like, man, that's right. There's so many times I also am like, all right, fine, I'll just go along with this. The right thing to do is like, no, I don't want your fine. God doesn't just want our fine. But to really look and see where we can, put our hand in, do the hard work, and reach out and take hold of the opportunity that God's put in front of us. And his faithfulness to that is, we question it, but it's really without question. He is who he is, and he does what he promises. And so that was definitely a place, even as I sort through hard things in my life. There's a lot up in the air this summer, and I've really been praying on a couple of things and haven't seen a shift yet. And I was reminded again this morning, as I was just back going through these, so I wouldn't ramble too much, of the power of waiting on God and knowing his faithfulness and trusting his hand, how he continues to show up as a redeemer in our lives and in our situations over and over. So my prayer for you is that as you read through this too, that there's places in your life that might be sensitive or hurt, places that you might feel abandoned or broken, and you begin to catch a glimpse of the redemption that God is actively working in your own hearts and lives and in the situations around you. So that is Ruth. Let me know if you have any other questions. I'm going to do the same, just like question reflection sheet that I've been doing. And as always, feel free to hit me up if there's any other thoughts or you'd like to dig into something deeper. And I hope you all are doing awesome. Talk to you later. Bye.